Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Leah Hines. I'm the Executive Director of the Charleston Library Conference, and I would like to welcome all of you to Preprints in Biomedicine Are Here. Why, how, and what's next? While we get started with a few announcements, I'm going to put up some poll questions. First of all, there's just a couple of questions about how best describes your role. To select one answer. And then what is your experience with preprints? And for that question, you can select all that apply. So have fun with those poll questions while I go through just a few announcements for housekeeping. So the session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be available to everyone who's registered. Whether you made it to the session today or not, you'll still get an email with a link to that so you can watch the video recording afterwards. We're going to be saving questions for our panelists until the end. I'll go through instructions in just a moment about how to ask questions, but we do ask that we wait until the end so that we don't interrupt the flow of the conversation. And we will have a short attendee evaluation after the webinar ends. It'll redirect you. It's like 3 questions, super short, but we do appreciate all of your feedback. So please take just a moment to fill that out when we're finished. We were joking that the world runs on Zoom now, but there are, in case you have some questions about how to participate or interact with us on Zoom, we'll go through just some quick directions here. Your audio setup, you're going to get the best audio quality by connecting through your computer and using those computer mic speaker settings. If you're having problems, you can also dial in through your phone and it'll give you directions on how to do that. Here at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a raise hand icon or a lower hand. We're not going to use that today, but right next to that is what I want you to pay attention to, the Q&A button. So if you click Q&A, you can type in your question as the speakers are giving their presentations. If something comes to mind that you want to ask a question about, you can type your question and hit send, and it'll save it to the end. So that way you don't have to worry about remembering, oh, what was that I had a question about? What did I want to ask? You can type it right then and there and send the question, and then we'll go through all of them at the end. There's also a chat button at the bottom left. If you're having technical difficulties or just want to ask a question, you can send one to me privately, and I'll try to help the best that I can. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew, who is our moderator today, to give a little bit of background on the topic and the Charleston briefings. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Leah. Well, as Leah said, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Charleston briefings, and today's podcast with Oya Rieger, Jessica Polka, and Iracha Puebla is on the same topic as their Charleston briefing on preprint servers in biomedicine. The Charleston briefings, Trending Topics for Information Professionals, is a thought-provoking series of brief books concerning innovation in the sphere of libraries, publishing, and technology and scholarly communication. The briefings, growing out of the vital conversations characteristic of the Charleston Conference and Against the Grain, offers valuable insights into the trends shaping our professional lives and the institutions in which we work. So let's proceed now to the conversation with Oya, Jessica, and Iracha, who will briefly introduce themselves, beginning, please, with Oya.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this forum. I'm Oya Rieger from Etika SNR, and those of you who do not know about Etika SNR, it's a non-for-profit organization focusing on research, consultancies, and strategic planning, working with higher education institutions and on a broad range of topics from research enterprise to scholar communication, from affordability of education to student success in community colleges. And up until last year, actually 2019, September, I was at Cornell University and I was the program director for Archive, ARXIV. And I did that with 10 years with great pleasure. And it's wonderful to be a part of this panel today.
Thanks. Maybe I can follow up on that. My name is Jessica Polka. I'm Executive Director of ASAP Bio, which is a small nonprofit organization working to increase transparency and innovation in life sciences publishing. So prior to my role in this organization, I was introduced to preprints as a preprint author during my postdoc. and became very passionate about advocating for their use in the life sciences. ASAP Bio grew out of a meeting organized by a group of scientists, including our founder, Ron Vale, and became a nonprofit organization years after that. So we were very interested in the use of preprints as well as open peer review. And I'm really delighted to be here today with my colleague, Racha, to speak to you.
Okay, so I guess I should go next. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Good afternoon, or good evening. I'm in the UK, so it's getting a bit dark here. But I'm Irache Puebla, Associate Director, working on Attendee Bio with Jessica. My training was in biotechnology, so I did several years of research, but the majority of my professional career was done in publishing, when I worked for a couple of open access publishers, initially Biomed Central, and then more recently plus the Public Library of Science. I became interested in preprints as part of my editorial work. I was watching innovation in that space quite closely. And then I'm very happy to say that earlier this year, in May, I moved to ASAP Bio. I'm working mostly on raising awareness around preprints and increasing community engagement. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Wonderful, thank you all. Well, why don't we get started then? And I think I will start with Jessica, just asking, what are preprints? And how are they used in the biomedical sciences now?
Thanks, Matthew. I think that the term preprint has several different definitions that have been used at different times. But typically, at least in life sciences, when we talk about preprints, we mean a manuscript that has been submitted by authors to a public server prior to the completion of a journal peer review process. So in the life sciences especially, perhaps because many servers are connected in one way or another to a journal with a bidirectional submission system, there is sort of a practice of submitting these preprints to the server around the same time that they're submitted to a journal. And as you can hear from my colleagues today, during this time that preprints are available while the paper is going through review, there's more opportunity for community exposure. And so, of course, during this time, authors can update the preprint, and some servers will allow updating the preprint with sort of a post-print version as well. So in the life sciences, preprints have been growing really kind of exponentially over the last few years. Beginning in 2013, we've seen tremendous growth from bioRxiv especially, and really great prominence in the field. It's recognized as a major preprint server. But in the last few years, there have also been other offerings, some connected to publishers, some serving sort of the medical community, medRxiv being the sort of sister server to bioRxiv, that have also grown in submissions. So I should say here that this graph, it provides an estimation, but does leave some things out. So for example, there are other preprint servers, dozens of preprint servers, in fact, that host content related to the life sciences. And so, I think creating a very accurate and complete graph is challenging, primarily due to the wealth of content out there. So right now, we are, preprint servers are seeing submissions cumulatively that are about 8% of the rate of all submissions to PubMed. So this is a huge growth from just a few years ago when the rate was below 1%. And I think many factors have contributed to this, but I think that strong funder support in the life sciences, first among private funders and also among public funders, has really created the impression that preprints are a valid way to share research outputs. So here in the US, there was a very influential NIH policy that stated that preprints can be cited in grant applications and reports anywhere that journal articles are in 2017. And subsequent to this, their inclusion on both Europe PMC and also now on PubMed means that they're getting increased exposure to researchers. That said, I think that the usage of preprints is certainly not even all around the world. Some of the countries that you see here highlighted on this map in this paper from Abdil and colleagues are kind of representative of countries that are doing a lot of publishing in the life sciences. And this figure from that paper as well indicates that, as you can see here, this red line is preprints being posted proportionally to journal articles. And so what you can see is that there's certain countries that are having an overrepresentation of preprints relative to other countries which have an underrepresentation of preprints relative to the total output. And there's also opportunities for other types of disparities in preprinting to emerge. So for example, over the COVID-19 pandemic, which we'll be talking about a bit later on, some preprint servers have seen a decrease in female first authors, kind of mirroring trends with journal publishers. So all of this is to say that preprints, which are technically available for anyone to post for free, are still not necessarily seeing equal uptake around the world. So I'm just curious if Iracha or Oya have anything to add to this.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
The only perhaps a small mention that I'll make, and maybe we'll come back to this as part of the discussion today, is that in addition to the disparities in terms of geographical representation, there is also disparities in the preprint usage across different research disciplines. And we have seen some disciplines where there was earlier and higher adoption, perhaps those where there was some intersection with within those communities that already had some culture of posting in the archives, so with the physical sciences, etc. And also in the context of COVID-19, obviously feels like infectious diseases and microbiology, they have really taken advantage of preprinting to share their findings. So there are disparities in terms of geographical usage, but also in terms of the research fields.
Yeah, I think, well, let's move to another question then. Why do people post preprints? Let's ask Iracha this question.
Yes, and I think that, well, there are a number of benefits that preprints provide to authors. I guess that the one that comes across as most easily, or is the most obvious one, is the speed of the communication of the research findings. So if we think about how preprints operate, usually the authors can submit their paper to a preprint server, and the paper is then posted in a matter of one day or perhaps only a few days. When we compare this to the traditional process of journal publication, that would be a process that, as we know, takes a number of months or even sometimes years, depending on the number of revisions and submission cycles. So what we see is that really the time frame for the dissemination of the findings is really accelerated through the use of preprints. Although that is the most obvious benefit, there are a number of other benefits, and I thought I would touch on a few other items that came from the responses to a survey that we ran earlier in the summer in collaboration with some of the participants of a workshop around preprints, which we hosted in January this year. And what we did was run a survey across a broad range of stakeholders and ask them to tell us a bit more about what they perceive as the benefits that the preprints provide. Again, the speed of research communication came as the top benefit, but there were a few other things that I think is worth mentioning. Another important benefit, a perceived benefit, is the fact that preprints are free to post and free to read. And I think this is, again, a relevant element to mention in the context of reducing barriers to participation in research communication. Again, if we compare this to the system and the traditional model of journal publication, we know that there are a number of journals that operate subscription models, which means that actually the articles will be published, but often are only accessible to those who are lucky enough to be affiliated at institutions that have a broad range of subscriptions to journals. Even if we add to this the element of open access journals, which obviously greatly facilitate access, some of those journals operate publication fees, which means that it can be difficult for researchers in some communities and depending on their funding resources to actually, again, take advantage of the potential for open access publication. So none of those barriers apply to preprints because, again, they are free to post and free to read to anyone who has an internet connection. Another relevant benefit that came from the responses to the survey related to the opportunity that they provide for authors to get additional exposure to their research. Authors can control and choose when they are ready to post their paper. And they can actually potentially use to also share the research perhaps earlier in the process in a more preliminary format and still disseminate and share that within their communities. And in fact, there are several studies that have looked at the attention and citations to publications, and they have shown that there is an association between the availability of an earlier version as a preprint for the paper and the number of citations and the level of attention that the journal publication gets. And then another benefit that I thought it was relevant to mention that came from the responses was the fact that the preprints also provide authors an opportunity to receive feedback. And again, they can choose when they are ready to share their work and when they are ready to receive those comments from their community. It is very easy for authors to send, again, the link or the copy of their preprint, get comments from others in their field, and actually use those comments to improve and polish their paper and potentially even choose to then send it for a journal publication at a later point. Something that has been an interesting development in this space is that we are also seeing increasing avenues for the community to provide open comments on preprints. There is some platforms, preprint servers that have commenting tools, but also platforms that are dedicated to the review of preprints. So I think that as we will likely see this commenting activity increase as we see further adoption of preprints across different fields.
Well, you know, I think as preprints are more and more important and used more and more, we also find that there are concerns among various people about preprints. And Oya, I wonder if you can talk about the concerns with reprints and how we can mitigate them.
Sure, excellent question. You know, I think when we think about both benefits and concerns, it's really important to acknowledge that we have a range of stakeholders with different opinions, and they are looking at the space with different eyes, depending on where they stand in the scholar communication chain: readers, writers, funders, those of us who provide discovery and access, so on and so forth. For instance, you know, just one example, a junior researcher might see preprints as an excellent venue to promote his or her work, and especially with you know, with fluid interactions with social media, might really take advantage of the speed of discovery and access. Whereas in the same institution, the provost at that university may have some questions about preprints if he or she is really thinking about credibility and quality of research and the branding and reputation of the institution. So just a quick example. Next slide, please. So let me kind of go into some more detailed examples, just you know, bearing in mind that stakeholders will approach questions about concerns differently. One issue that almost everyone is agreeing on is the importance of quality control. And there are now more than 60, last time I counted, which was in May, there were 60 preprint services. And that, and of course, in many disciplines, and I know that today we are focusing on biomedicine, but I would say only a handful of them do have a transparent and reliable quality control mechanism in means of taking the submission through a very simple, low-level screening process to make sure that they really are coming from a scientist. It indeed is on a scholarly issue. There are, IRB or some other policies have been taken care of, not necessarily the, the intricate level of review in means of the scientific content. And this issue especially gained great importance recently with COVID-19, and also I would say with the entry of several preprint services in the biomedicine area. There are now kind of, more, I would say, questions about quality as it applies to especially human life. But also I must note, it's about trust in science, public trust in science. There have been some kind of, maybe 2 cases or 3 cases, but they got lots of attention showing claims made in a preprint, and these are published in newspapers, and then, there's retractions. There's definitely issue about public's trust in these materials. Next slide, please. Actually, Irachi showed you the same slide focusing on benefits, value of preprints. And here you see that there is a list of concerns. Just want to kind of quickly highlight that in this research with 512 respondents, definitely the quality-related issues and dissemination of unvetted, unpeer-reviewed information was an important concern. And I must really note that some preprint services such as medRxiv or bioRxiv are making a special point to put disclaimers on various points on their website to indicate that these materials have not been peer-reviewed yet. So I just wanted to note that. But again, I want to highlight that there are many preprint services now, and then the practices are not necessarily consistent. Next, please. Just to highlight a couple other potential risks. I attended a webinar last week hosted by Johns Hopkins University Public Health, School of Public Health. And interestingly, it was hosted by the provost. It was really good to see the provost involved at this level. And one issue that, of course, there was great praise for preprints, role of preprints, but as they were talking about the risks, one thing that I highlighted was this information deluge. There's so much information out there now, published journal articles, blogs, various social media posts, preprints where you sometimes don't even know which version or where the work is in means of review process. And that really brings me to the second bullet point, which is the integrity of scholarly record. We have a tradition of seeing a published journal as a unit of scholarly information knowledge with quality stamp, and that we trust that as a scholarly record. Now, given that there may be preprints and sometimes there might be various versions, one on a preprint service, the other one on a university's institutional repository, a couple of them on perhaps different academic networks, and not necessarily knowing sometimes which one came first, which one has been reviewed. That certainly is a problem for some audiences, especially those who are not really accustomed to and comfortable with understanding versioning. And you may know that ORCID a few years ago came up with a model where they're also providing ORCID IDs for preprints. Although it's definitely one step forward in means of approaching this problem of integrity of scholar record, but I would say it's still, we still have some work that needs to be done. Business models, journals. I mean, look at the journal publishing or book publishing industry. We do have business models, whether it's green, gold, subscription-based. There are revenues coming and there are expenses going out. Whereas with preprints, we haven't come up yet with a durable, scalable business model. When I was overseeing archive, actually one of my roles was to develop a sustainability model. And although there was a formula in generating annual income, but it was really every year, it was a new year, wondering if I'm going to be able to meet that budget. And I want to really highlight preservation, especially I know that I have several library staff colleagues on this call. There are questions about the durability and long-term access and discoverability of these resources. So just some highlights.
Yeah, and I think those bring us really to the question, given that this is a sort of emerging publication model, how do preprints fit into the publication process? Mr. Siparacha. I think you're.
Sorry, I think that something that is relevant to mention here is that the fields where preprints are considered somewhat of a new phenomenon are more again in the biomedical sciences. In the physical sciences, researchers have operated with the archive for a number of years, and actually for journals who publish that research, they again coexisted relatively easily with preprints. So what we have seen in the life sciences is that there's been a certain evolution in this space. I guess that for so many years, the use of preprints as a means of research communication was not very common for researchers in the life sciences. So many journals, either they didn't have dedicated policies around it because it was not a thing that they encountered, or in some fields, they had operated under some policies where actually they would not consider work posted as a preprint. Some of this is the legacy from something called the Ingelfinger rule that was implemented by the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine quite a few years ago, which stipulated that essentially the journal would only would not consider work that had been disseminated by other means prior to publication with them. It was to a certain degree to avoid duplication in publications and bias in the literature, but also to a certain degree as well to protect the originality of the work that was being published in the journal. So there was some legacy around this in that a number of, particularly within the medical sciences, a number of journals there, they would apply this interpretation of this rule to also encompass preprints. We have seen, I would say, quite a bit of an evolution here as the researchers have used preprints more and more for the dissemination of their work. And what we have now is that the majority of biomedical journals actually operate policies that are compatible with preprints. There are some exceptions, so some journals have still indicated that they would not publish work that has appeared as a preprint before, but the majority within the biomedical sciences, again, have editorial policies that are at least compatible with preprinting. And then I think that another interesting development is that actually, in addition to updating their editorial policies, a number of journals and publishers have actually looked to integrate their workflows so that the preprints become part of their pathways. There are a number of ways in which we are seeing this increasing integration between journals and preprints, and if I can have the next slide. This can be in both directions. We have now mechanisms for transfers through some preprint platforms into journals. So again, if the researcher chooses to post their work as a preprint, they may later on choose to, from that preprint record, transfer to a partner journal that operates within that workflow. In the opposite direction, we're also seeing journals who, again, in addition to being compatible with preprint, they want to provide the option as a service for researchers to have their work posted as a preprint in parallel to their own journal process. So there are a number of publishers that operate this. For example, PLOS has partnered with bioRxiv to provide this service. Another important example in this space is Research Square that has partnered with a number of journals within Springer Nature to, again, offer this to authors. So at the moment that they receive the journal submission, they will also offer to the authors to have in parallel the paper submitted to be posted as a preprint, which allows the authors the benefit of, again, having the work publicly available and disseminated in parallel to the journal undertaking their own peer review process. We are also seeing, again, increasing interest among editors in terms of keeping up to date with the latest research that is being posted as preprints, and actually some journals have now appointed preprint editors who will check for research posted as a preprint to see if it's suitable for the journals, and if that's the case, they may even invite submissions. So again, this is an opportunity for authors to increase the reach and visibility of the research and even increase the opportunity for publication. Another thing that I think is relevant that this further integration between preprints and journals is opening up is the opportunity for innovation in peer review. Given that the work, again, is made available in parallel to the peer review process at the journal, which often operates in a much more close way. So if you have your paper posted as a preprint, you may be getting comments, again, through the preprint platform elsewhere that potentially could be incorporated also into the pool of reviews that inform the journal decision. This is a very interesting development because there's been quite a bit of discussion around the peer review process and how we could potentially improve, or at least that we need to improve it and try new options. There's been some attempts to do this, and some new innovation that came up over the last years. One example is Faculty of 1000, which actually took the innovative step of actually turning the journal process on its head, and essentially operates on the approach of publishing the paper first and then running the peer review, which is the opposite sequence to what the traditional journal would do, which is take the paper, do the peer review, and then publish. So I think that overall, again, the preprint adoption and opens new opportunities also for innovation in peer review, and that's something that we can probably expect to happen going forward. From my perspective, one element that I think is particularly relevant in all of this is that what we are seeing really is that preprints are being increasingly recognized as a step in the whole cycle of communicating research. Researchers tend to communicate with others in their community, with their collaborators, discuss their work at conferences. So that type of interaction was happening already in the past, and what preprints are doing is facilitating those interactions, making it much easier and faster for that exchange and advance to happen.
Yes, and I think most of us are much more aware of preprints now because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I guess the question is, how has the pandemic had an impact on preprinting? And Jessica, what role have preprints played in the pandemic?
Well, I think COVID-19 has had really powerful impacts in many areas of life and research, and certainly demonstrated the need for the rapid communication of research results to others within the scientific community, and the rigorous evaluation of those results as they're getting converted into policy very rapidly. So preprints have been used, perhaps unsurprisingly, at an unprecedented way during this pandemic. there have been kind of thunder calls for the use of preprints, specifically coming from Wellcome and other funders regarding the Zika outbreak and Ebola outbreaks. But this COVID-19 pandemic really represents the first time that there has been a widespread usage of preprints to communicate results from the pandemic. I think that this was especially apparent early in the course of the pandemic. So these are numbers from the NIH's Office of Portfolio Analysis. So this focuses on things within that research portfolio, so funded by the NIH. But what you can see is that especially early in the pandemic, preprints are representing a really significant fraction of the research that was released. So though many journals have taken serious efforts to accelerate the peer review process for manuscripts that are related to COVID-19, the urgency with which researchers feel to communicate, I think, really drove a lot of usage of preprints during this time. And this is accompanied by major growth in the submission rate to medRxiv, which has become kind of the major destination for preprints related to COVID-19, though they are also found on many other servers. So together with some colleagues, we analyzed the kind of attention and characteristics of COVID-19 preprints, and found that preprints on COVID-19 were receiving approximately tenfold as many abstract views, PDF downloads, tweets, and general attention as non-COVID-19 preprints. So clearly this is a matter that is of great importance to basically the general public, to readers that are outside of the traditional kind of recipients of preprints. So this, I think the usage of preprints during the pandemic has really broadened awareness of them, both to kind of disciplines of science that were not necessarily using them before, and to the general public as well. So, actually it's, we found that authors of the COVID-19 preprints were first-time authors of preprints, like 83% of the time, compared to something like 60-some% for non-COVID-19 preprints. So I think the urgency of communication is really something that's unique during a pandemic. So I should say that the preprints covering COVID-19 tend to also be shorter, both in their word count and the number of figures and tables. And there is some suggestion, perhaps one way of interpreting that is that these are results that are shared perhaps at an earlier point in the process without having to accumulate a huge story, linking together a mechanistic explanation of why things are happening, but rather researchers are choosing to share data at an earlier stage. Now, as Oya mentioned, of course, with the great importance of these preprints in terms of public health, there is, of course, a fear that information that's carried within them could be misinterpreted, or that false information could be propagated and be harmful to public health. So, certainly there have been kind of infamous examples of preprints being posted on a server or circulated on a general repository and feeding into conspiracy theories. I think that there's this is a general problem of information on the internet now, where, I would say that I think that the challenge lies in figuring out how to appropriately label preprints and also invite feedback on preprints in such a way that they can be put into context. I think that today people can circulate papers on their personal blog. They can just send a Dropbox link around. Things can become amplified on Twitter and Facebook, on Medium. And the information environment, I think, is quite noisy and prone to misinformation and disinformation. But I think the notices that preprint servers have been posting that Oya mentioned are certainly one way that platforms can exert a little bit of context. And I think one thing that's been really encouraging is that there have been a number of new review organizations that have sprung up to help provide expert opinion on these preprints. So, for example, in January, there was a preprint posted, which was withdrawn within about 48 hours, claiming that there was similarity between COVID and HIV. But between the time that this preprint was posted and withdrawn, it received over 100 comments. So basically, I think there's a potential for these very interesting preprints to be kind of put into context by the community. And these initiatives here, I'd just like to highlight 3 of them. The Sinai Immunology Review Project, Rapid Reviews COVID-19, and Outbreak Science Rapid Pre-Review are all geared towards organizing peer review process on top of preprints. So certainly while this kind of commenting can happen organically, these 3 projects represent an opportunity to have a little bit more structure around that. We actually maintain a list of different preprint review projects that I can drop into the chat as well if you're interested in looking into that.
Excellent. Well, as we move to the end here, I think I'll ask Oya, what is the future of preprinting? What does it look like, and how might it compare to something like F1000, the Faculty of 1000? What is the difference between them, and what does it look like for preprinting?
Well, this is a great question, and I'm afraid this question easily can, in and of itself, be a session. So I'm going to try to make it as brief as I can, because we are just looking forward to hearing comments and questions from the participants. Jessica, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to actually look into 2 issues, and for both issues, I put a citation here, actually some of my work, just in case if anybody's interested in digging a bit deeper, given that time is very limited. I would say if you look into the future and try to imagine where preprints are going, or make wishes where preprints are going, I'm going to look into 2 angles. The first one is technical angle, technical infrastructure. And with the technical infrastructure, preprints really began with arXiv, SSRN, and then of course bioRxiv and many others came, very successful establishments, mainly kind of independent entities, of course working, collaborating with the other nodes of scholar communication, but organizational independent. However, we definitely are seeing during the last few years, I wouldn't call it a trend, but increasing involvement of publishers in preprints. And that's actually why I wanted to point out this piece that Roger and I worked on. Many publishers are now establishing preprint services that are very much tightly coupled with their, or not always, but usually tightly coupled with their process of the submissions, the review, preprint posting, final version, sometimes even data support. And I think F1000, I will mention F1000 just because, Matthew, you asked about it. It's developed as a platform, as an open science platform, and it's owned by Taylor and Francis. And that what they are doing is really they're experimenting with this kind of concept of reinventing, rather than having preprint servers, journals, and then other repositories and trying to make them interoperable. They're experimenting with this kind of the full life cycle from submission all the way to preservation or all the way to maintenance and discovery stage. And that we are seeing, especially funding groups such as Gates or Wellcome Trust, working with platforms such as F1000, because I think there's definitely some value from their perspective, obviously, in this integration of various stages. And again, I want to note that it sometimes involves research data too. That really is, this is kind of a direction that we need to look into, the balance between independent, organizational independent, collaborative, but organizational independent preprints versus the ones that are really becoming more of the publishing enterprise. Of course, the metadata for discovery, access, and many other purposes is getting lots of attention, especially for quality control. But also we have some kind of early evidence, and I heard this from SSRN and some other colleagues, using artificial intelligence or other computational-based methods in extracting metadata or improving the metadata. Next slide, please. The other important issue is really the sociocultural infrastructure. Again, I kind of cited sort of my work a few months ago, just because I want to really highlight that there are 60+ preprint servers, although today we are focusing on biomedicine, but even within biomedicine, there are distinctive disciplinary cultures and practices, and that we are hearing more and more interdisciplinary research. I recently had the pleasure of working with some medical science, academic medical science librarians, and they were really mentioning about the increasing interdisciplinary doctors working with sociologists, with statisticians, so on and so forth. So in means of preprints and their current focus on disciplinary clusters, this is really one angle that we may need to look into. This is my last point, but it's really incredibly important that in many forums nowadays, we are hearing about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusivity. But I think the challenge we have as a community is, how do we put into practice? How do we start implementing to illustrate how this could be done? Preprints actually originally with Archive, they were promoted as venues of open access. There was a belief that they will be leveling the playing field and they would democratize scientific communication. But there's evidence, as Irachi mentioned, according to a recent study, based on bioarchive prints, they concluded that countries such as the US and UK are overrepresented relative to their overall scientific output. So just wanted to kind of, as I said, this is, we could talk about this for hours, what is next for preprints, but it's a good also time to transition to questions and comments.
Thank you all very much. Let's move on to the questions.
Oh, by the way, can you go back, Jessica? I think I wanted to kind of leave this. I rushed a bit because we are running out of time, but I love what Dario said in this article, and I want to highlight that, what we are really trying to do is make science better and get better outputs to make the world better. So, I thought that this would be a good slide to end our talk. Thank you.
Thank you. So Leah, shall we move on?
Yes, sorry about that. So Matthew, do you want to handle the questions for the Q&A portion, or would you like me to read them out to the panelists?
I can handle the questions if you want to deal with the poll. And
Sure. So I'll turn the poll on. We've got a final poll question, or two questions actually, for everyone to answer while our panelists are going through their questions. So there you are. There's one question about the role of preprints in COVID-19, and what do you think the future holds for preprints? So with that, Matthew, take it away with the questions. Thanks.
All right. Well, I think the first question is, with the vast increase in systematic reviews, how do you compare what you bring into a systematic review when it has preprints versus other sorts of material?
I can handle this, or try if you like. Yeah, that's an interesting question, because obviously systematic reviews aim to pull information from the existing literature to address a specific question and try to, again, increase the sample size and provide a stronger answer to the question. I think the important thing to remember is that guidelines for systematic reviews have always encouraged the inclusion of gray literature. So obviously inclusion of publications in journals, but also evidence from other sources. So I don't see an issue necessarily in terms of including preprints, provided that the person who is undertaking the systematic review is clear and that the source is different from a journal article that has been peer reviewed. As Jessica mentioned earlier, in the context of COVID-19, especially in the initial months of the pandemic, a high proportion of the findings and the evidence was being disseminated as preprints. So it was particularly relevant to be inclusive and look at the findings that were coming up in the preprint servers if an author was looking to, again, do a systematic review within that field. I think that this is an area where probably we need to develop further guidelines that perhaps refine the options for searching within the preprints a little bit more. I think it's one of the challenges right now that there is a number of methodologies to search through PubMed and other bibliographic databases for journal articles, and that's a bit less developed for preprints. A good source for this is Europe PMC, which has very nice search strings, for example, for COVID-19, and now indexes preprints. So yeah, interesting area where I think we will see more guidelines developed.
Okay, and I guess a question then is, when preprints are entered into a database such as PubMed, are the preprint citations merged with the final published article when this happens, or do they distinguish?
So if I could be wrong, please do correct me, Oya or Arachi, but my understanding is that PubMed is linking from the preprint record to the final article record. So there is this linkage. As far as the consolidation of citations between the two versions, I think that there's a little bit of differences of approach for different indexing platforms, but certainly I know that Google Scholar for years has aggregated the citations to a preprint version and a final article version. Jeroen Bosman has done a really nice kind of accounting of which indexing platforms are tracking which preprints. And I think that the issue of aggregating citations is one that is beneficial both to authors, to readers, so they know the total amount of interest, and also to, frankly, journal editors who are, being able to kind of get a sense for the overall impact of a piece of work at all stages. So I think that this is something that would be really beneficial for all indexing platforms to do.
Another interesting question, is this preprint being driven in part by changes in federal regulations requiring that the results of publicly funded research be made freely available to the public? An example being the pre-published final draft of a journal article being submitted to PubMed prior to going under copyright upon publication of peer-reviewed journal.
Maybe I'll take a shot at that one. It's a really, really interesting question. And I'm afraid it's difficult to give a general response because it very much depends on, it's also sometimes depends on the country and the public access policies. But I'll just give you a very quick example of Plan S because it got lots of attention last year in the United States too. With Plan S, which is a European-based public access mandate, there were definitely questions and concerns about whether preprint services can be seen as a submission resort to fulfill open access mandates, because they were looking for either author submitted or the version in the published journal. So they were looking for version of record. Again, I don't want to make generalizations, but it really depends on whether public access policy is requiring the deposit of version of record, the peer-reviewed, on a repository, public repository, or if they're allowing also peer review, or sometimes they might be encouraging different versions.
Yeah. Well, I think another question. In the benefits of preprint sharing graph, around 60% report enabling sharing results that don't fit in journals as a benefit. Mm-hmm. Do we know what percentage of preprints on a platform such as bioRxiv never appear in a traditional published form? Could it be as high as 60%?
Yeah, so there is actually a study, I believe it was published on eLife, I'll find it and post it on the chat, that actually looked at essentially what was the rate of publication of papers that had been posted on bioRxiv, and what they found was that 2/3 of the preprints had appeared in a journal within 2 years. I mean, we had to take into account the time lag as well. Obviously, it takes some time for a paper to go from the preprint format to the journal publication, either because the authors may wish to revise or because the publication process takes the time it takes. But it was essentially 2/3 were coming up as articles within 2 years. And I believe this matched an earlier study from preprints in the archives, so for the physical sciences. The other thing I want to mention is that I don't think it's necessarily surprising that we wouldn't see 100% publication rate for preprints. There are some papers the authors choose to post because they would like feedback from their community, or perhaps there's a call to action, or they want to see what the reaction is from their peers. And they use preprints to disseminate those papers that they may never have intended to publish as a journal publication. So that's a particular benefit that is useful, and essentially I don't think it needs to be interpreted as implying any level of quality on the preprint. It's just that the researchers are using it as a means of communication, also for outputs and activities that they may not intend to publish in a journal.
Leah, do we have time for another question?
You know,
Sure, I
just
think we can do one more.
One
if
more?
I may just make a very quick,
Please.
quick correction. I mentioned ORCID. It's not ORCID, obviously it's DOI IDs for versioning. ORCID
Okay.
is for the author, but I noticed that there's a question about do we assign DOIs for preprint? So just want to apologize for if I confused anyone. It's not the ORCID ID, it's the DOI.
Okay, thank you, Leah. I guess one of the last questions then is that we think of preprints as gray literature, and there's already a substantial gray literature in conference proceedings and blog posts and things like that. Has there been a substantial impact on how we see gray literature since preprints have become so popular?
I'm not aware of any research on this topic, but I do think that maybe I can just share kind of some anecdotal perceptions. There has been some pushback from the community about preprints that were posted either without a methods section, ongoing discussions over data and code availability, accompanying preprints, etc. You know, from my own field, like cell biology, we have long had conference abstracts available to be searched and discovered. But the actual meat of the presentation, so the slides, the posters, are ephemeral, and they're not complete in any case. A preprint has the complete information that would be needed to replicate a study, at least in the narrative form. So I think that, you know, perhaps there's this sense that a growing sense that of disclosure that does not contain this kind of information is, you know, not really serving open science to the same extent as one that actually enables researchers to build off of and grow that work.
If I may very quickly add, perhaps you may need to differentiate between preprint and preprint servers, because, you know, when we say preprint, it is the pre-reviewed version of a scholarly article, preprint. Whereas when you think about preprint servers, they do have content policies. Some, in addition to preprints, also accept conference papers, slides, syllabus, data. So it really depends on the content policy of the preprint server, what they accept, in addition to preprints.
Excellent.
Thank you. So Matthew, are we wrapping up now? This is it? Okay. Well, I want to say thank you to Matthew for moderating the session today, and to all of our panelists for a fascinating conversation. I learned so much in this hour. So thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for attending and participating. Don't forget to complete our very, very short attendee survey. After the webinar closes, you'll be redirected to that page. If you have any questions or comments about the webinar or future webinars, past webinars, you can give me an email. My email address is there on the screen. And just a quick note that 2020 Charleston Conference registration is now open. You can go to our website there. The tentative schedule will be posted later today, so keep an eye out for that. It's very exciting. I'm excited to share that with everyone. And I think that's it for today. We will see you at our next webinar. Thanks a lot and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.